Welcome back to our series on climate change. In the first video, we had established that climate change caused by anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions has emerged as one of the most important environmental, social and political issues of our time. The next two videos will shed light on and critically analyze two landmark attempts of the global scale to control the impact of climate change. Increasing international concern for climate change gave birth to the Kyoto Protocol in 1997. In this video, we argue that the Kyoto Protocol is a fundamentally flawed agreement. We attempt to point out how particular features of the protocol have resulted in short-sighted behavior on part of the member states and have thwarted the protocol from meeting the expectations it was established with. The origins of the Kyoto Protocol date to the 1992 Rio Earth Summit, where the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change was established. The aim of the protocol was to achieve stabilization of greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere at a level that would prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference in the climate. On 11 December 1997, at the third conference of the parties to the UNFCCC, representatives from over 150 nations gathered in Kyoto, Japan to hammer out what would become the world's first international agreement to control and reduce greenhouse gas emissions. The Kyoto Protocol would become one of the most inspirational as well as controversial treaties ever signed.
Simply put, this treaty was supposed to keep greenhouse gas emissions from human activity at a level scientists believed would offer the best chance of preventing catastrophic climatic change. It was a treaty that committed 37 industrialized nations plus the European community to cut their emissions of 6 greenhouse gases by an average of 5% by 2012 compared with 1990 levels. The 6 gases targeted for reduction included carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, hydrofluorocarbons, perfluorocarbons, and sulfur hexafluoride. Carbon dioxide was the gas that policymakers were most concerned about. The 15 countries in the European Union at the time, as well as some Eastern European countries and Switzerland, had targets of 8% below 1990 levels. The United States committed to a 7% reduction, and Japan, along with Canada, Hungary, and Poland, agreed to a 6% cut. These binding targets covered only developed countries. Emerging economies like China and India were exempted from setting numerical targets and promised only to do their best to reduce emissions.
There are still hard challenges ahead, especially in the area of involvement by the developing nations. It's essential that they participate in a meaningful way if we are to truly tackle this problem. But the joint implementation provisions of the agreement open the way to that result.
After George W. Bush became president in 2001, he announced that America was not going to ratify the protocol. For other nations, however, the protocol took effect in February 2005. The proponents of the protocol celebrated it as a breakthrough in international climate policy because it promised, under the original provisions, substantial emission reductions for the developed world, and it laid the groundwork for climate protection activities in the future.
Protocol critics claim that developing countries will be the largest contributors of greenhouse gases within the next 15 years due to industrialization, deforestation, and the increasing use of automobiles in those nations. Since the protocol imposes absolutely no binding reduction targets on these countries, critics, especially in the United States, argue that it will fail to reduce aggregate global emissions, as well as harm the economies of the developed world. However, a group of politicians who call this roadblock the fairness issue, referring to the question of whether it is fair that developed countries bear the economic brunt of emission reductions if they aren't the major contributors, counter by insisting that fairness actually demands decisive action on the end of these developed countries for two reasons. First, developed countries are currently and historically responsible for more emissions than any other nation. And second, developed nations can afford to pay the associated costs. However, It is a given that eventually developing countries too will need to cut down their greenhouse gas emissions. It is in the interest of the global community that their development is done sustainably, but it is impossible to expect them to take on reduction targets with the same time frame as developed countries.
The issue of carbon trading became one of the most controversial aspects of the protocol. Article 17 of the Kyoto Protocol established emissions trading by allowing countries or industries that have emission units to spare, which are emissions permitted to them but unused, to sell this excess capacity to countries that are over their emissions limits. In effect, this created a new commodity in the form of emissions and created a carbon market. Since CO2 is the principal greenhouse gas, emissions trading effectively became carbon trading. Carbon emissions trading has been steadily increasing in recent years.
We've seen in the EU emissions trading scheme, emissions have gone up, profits have gone up for coal-fired power producers, the nuclear power industry, and unfortunately prices have also gone up for average people.
Compliance, or the extent to which states alter their behavior consistently with the provisions of an institution, is a key consideration in evaluating a regime. The first task in evaluating Kyoto performance, therefore, is to assess the extent to which states complied with both the letter and spirit of the institution. So how did Kyoto fare in terms of compliance? Canadian carbon dioxide emissions increased by 25% from 1990 to 2012, and Japan's emissions increased by 14% over the same period. The success rate improves when we turn our attention to Europe, which achieved a 15% reduction in emissions from 1990 levels in the EU 15, well beyond the 8% target set for that group. This success, however, was not universal among the EU 15. The burden sharing arrangement allowed for expanded efforts in some states to make up for the lack of reductions in others. Therefore, only 8 of the 15 countries were reported to have met their individual targets. The remaining 7 were not on track to meet their requirements according to 2013 data. Their compliance rested not on their own actions, but those of their EU partners. In summary, even though Kyoto set a relatively low threshold for emission reductions, states still struggled to comply. Some left the regime entirely, while others remained participants but failed to meet their obligations.
An efficient climate regime would be one where cooperation is sought through a single or small number of institutions as opposed to one that is fragmented into a large number of forums. Effectiveness simply refers to whether or not a policy has worked as intended. Globally, emissions have increased. CO2 emissions in 1990 were 22.7 billion tons. By 2008 were 31.7 billion tons, and in 2013 were recorded to be 36 billion tons. Granted, much of the increase is due to emissions from countries that are not bound by the protocol, notably China and the United States, who together are responsible for approximately 40% of global carbon dioxide emissions. But this simply raises more questions concerning why policymakers chose to focus their attention for 15 years on an accord with little impact on key actors.
We argue that there are primarily 3 features that led to the failure of Kyoto. Firstly, the short span between implementation and the commitment period was problematic, since it incentivized countries to pick the low-hanging fruit rather than bringing about fundamental socio-economic changes which would in the longer run help control climate change. The time horizon limited the policy options for signatories. For example, 7 years, from 2005 to 2012, would be too short for a country to transition to non-greenhouse gas producing nuclear energy. A new plant itself would take 5 to 7 years to build. Secondly, the short time span severely limited the possibility for research and development of understudied sources of renewable energy, such as solar or wind energy. In addition, as carbon outputs were assigned to the country that produced GHGs, rather than those that consumed the products they created, countries could shift domestic production overseas, creating a decrease in emissions for accounting purposes but leading to a net global increase in emissions. This does not mean that the Kyoto Protocol is entirely without merit. Indeed, its most significant impacts occurred in spite of its design. It initiated the inclusion of climate change on the agendas of governments around the globe. In another time or place, Kyoto could have had the potential to be the right solution. Timing, then, is crucial to the climate story.